I'm Scott Lucas. This is today's EA Worldview on Syria. No one is winning. On the third anniversary of the conflict last weekend, the Washington Post declared a victor. The headline, Assad is steadily winning. The report was careful to say this wasn't going to be an overnight victory, but it said you could rest assured that the Damascus regime was going to triumph over the opposition and the insurgency. Why? It said that Assad was advancing steadily on several military fronts. It said that rebels were hopelessly divided. It said that they were now bereft of foreign assistance. And thus we could say, more than 3 years after protesters appeared on the streets to challenge the legitimacy, the justice, the rule of President Assad, that they had failed. Really? This is an example of a news media grabbing at headlines, grabbing at dubious statements from so-called monitoring groups, and, quite frankly, losing the plot on the ground. Let's have a look, shall we? It's very true that the regime has had a significant military success in the last week. It took the city of Yabrud, 60 kilometers north of Damascus, a major prize in the attempt to control the Kalamoun region between the Lebanese border and the Syrian capital. It is true that the regime has made advances west of Homs, putting insurgents under pressure in the Crusader Castle, the Croix de Chevalier. It is true that the regime has held back insurgent advances on other fronts, say, for example, the insurgent offensive at the end of last year in East Ghouta, the province near Damascus. But you know what else has happened? In the north, in Aleppo province, insurgents have been advancing in the countryside, including reaching the northern edge of Aleppo city and taking a neighborhood there. In the east and Deir ez-Zor, they have been clearing out regime positions. On the south, close to the demilitarized zone with Israel, they have steadily made advances until they have taken most of the towns and villages near Quneitra. In Daraa this past week, they liberated the central prison, freeing hundreds of detainees. They cleared away regime checkpoints. In other words, in areas in the north, east, and south of Syria, it is the insurgents who are putting the Syrian military under pressure, threatening to cut their supply lines, and quite often forcing retreats. You'll see none of this in the Washington Post story. And as for those divisions amongst the insurgents, it is absolutely true that there have been tensions, most notably the fight the insurgents have had to wage against the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham since the start of this year. It is true this has caused hundreds of casualties. It is true that in certain battles, insurgents have lacked coordination. More importantly, they have lacked supplies. But that is only in certain battles. The Washington Post never notices, for example, the formation of the Islamic Front at the end of last year, perhaps the largest insurgent bloc in more than 2 years. It never notices that some weapons and supplies are getting to the insurgents, despite the reluctance of the United States and tension between foreign backers such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar. In other words, the Washington Post doesn't notice the complexity of the war, because that doesn't make for a great headline, does it? War drags on, war stalemate, more months, years of conflict. The reality doesn't make for an easy resolution. But of course, that's the point. There is no easy resolution here. I was looking back at EA's coverage a couple years ago, and I've got to be honest, because this shouldn't just simply be a slam of the Washington Post. Our writers said in 2012 that Assad had perhaps a few months, maybe 6 months before he was forced from power. We were wrong. We were wrong. We underestimated the tenacity of the regime. We underestimated the amount of support it would get from Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah. We overestimated the ability of insurgents to coordinate on the ground. But recognizing that we were wrong 2 years ago makes it even more imperative that we challenge easy conclusions today that go the other way. The insurgents have not won. Assad is not winning. And the Syrian people are certainly continuing to lose. I'm Scott Lucas, and this is today's EA Worldview on Syria.